Hello, and welcome to the Record of Arms. Today we're going to begin a new series, which I'll be putting out along with the rest of the series about the SVD Dauntless and Brewster Buffalo aircraft. This one will focus on the naval aspects of the Spanish Civil War. This will be a revision of one of the older series I did for my podcast, revised somewhat and put into the new, shorter format. I hope this provides a little more variety of content for you to choose from. As usual, the sources for this one can be found in the description, along with a link to my Patreon if you like what I do here and would like to kick in $1 or $2. So with that out of the way, let's start in on the Spanish Civil War at sea. In mid-1936, on the eve of the military revolt in Spain, there were about 20,000 officers and men serving in the Spanish Navy, including naval aviation and marines. Many of the problems of the Army, such as the corrupt leadership and outdated or poorly maintained equipment, also affected the Navy. The Navy played a less prominent role in Spanish politics than did the Army, but that was mainly the result of its smaller size. As in the case of the Army, the personnel of the Navy were divided between a privileged and overlarge officer corps and the poorly treated and ill-paid sailors of the lower decks who, like their counterparts ashore, were almost all conscripts serving their mandatory year of military service. Many naval officers themselves were drawn from the less privileged classes of Spanish society. The Naval Officer Corps was, in fact, like that of the Army, one of the few avenues of social mobility in Spanish society. While some degree of class friction between officers and men was not unusual in the militaries of the day, in the radicalized political atmosphere of Republican Spain they would become much more dangerous. In the Army, political organizations grew up amongst the officers. A right-wing group, known as the UME, or the Unión Militar Española, attracted many of the more ambitious and competent officers, as well as many of higher rank. These men nursed grievances against the state and society of Spain, held an idea that the duty of the military was to safeguard the honor and historical patrimony of the Spanish nation. To accomplish this overriding task, according to their view, the military was permitted, or perhaps bound, to act on its own authority when it determined this to be necessary, regardless of the will of the legal government. This idea was rooted in the last century of Spanish history, and by 1936 the confidence of these officers, and their naval counterparts, in the Spanish Republic had fallen so low that they began to make their first move towards a coup. Although a few naval officers could be found amongst the ringleaders of the insurrection, the majority were in fact in sympathy with the idea of toppling the Republic by means of a military coup, as had been done several times since the middle decades of the previous century. Among the ordinary sailors, however, a great deal of political organization had been taking place, and these men adamantly opposed the overthrow of the Republic. These sailors' organizations were politically far left or at least left Republican. Similar left-wing organizations existed among the soldiers of the Army as well, but the process of politicization and organization had gone much further amongst the sailors. This political split between command rank officers and the lower ranks of the Navy was a representation in miniature of the social conflict in the country at large, in which the divisions fell almost entirely along class lines. The Spanish Navy had 3 major bases on the mainland territory. 2 of these were on the Atlantic coast, near the western corners of the Iberian Peninsula, at El Ferrol in the northwest and at Cadiz in the southwest. The third major base faced the Mediterranean, at Cartagena on the southeastern coast. The first 2 of these were the major termini of trade with Spain's overseas empire during the Golden Age in the 16th century. The third faced the Mediterranean and was historically the chief base of Spanish, and before that Aragonese, trade and policy in the Middle Sea. At these bases were housed the fleet's major facilities, including construction yards, schools, dry docks, workshops, communications and warehousing, as well as other specialist installations. A 4th major base was established in the Mediterranean, in the waters facing Corsica and Sardinia to the east of the peninsula. This was located at Mahon, on Minorca and the Balearic Islands. The excellent deep-water harbor here lay in a position to command most of the western basin of the Mediterranean, and the British had established a royal dockyard there as early as 1715. This naval station had been in Spanish hands since 1802. The base at Mahon lacked much of the construction capacity of the mainland bases, and at the time of the revolt only light units and submarines were based there. Smaller naval facilities were present at various points along the coast, as well as on the coast of Spanish Morocco and in the Canary Islands. Construction of Spanish vessels during the early decades of the 20th century was undertaken mostly at El Ferrol and Cartagena. The harbor at El Ferrol had the largest basin, and as a result, ships of cruiser size and above, including Spain's dreadnought battleships, were constructed there. Smaller vessels, including destroyers and submarines, were built at Cartagena. Of the major units of the fleet in 1936, almost all had been built in Spanish yards. This was a change from the fleets of earlier decades, during which many major vessels were contracted to be built by French or British yards. This change was the result of two developments. First was the decimation of the Spanish fleet by that of the United States in the Spanish-American War just before the turn of the century. This destroyed the obsolete ships Spain had on hand, while the loss of the Caribbean and Philippine Islands drastically reduced Spain's overseas naval commitments. This strategic disaster, however, meant that the nation could now adequately be served by a navy of a much smaller size. This meant that a balanced, modern force could be created with Spain's own limited resources. The second development was a reorganization of the Spanish shipbuilding industry designed to facilitate a new building program. A naval law was passed in 1908, providing for the construction of a new fleet built around a corps composed of 3 dreadnought battleships. A new semi-private entity was created to carry this out. This was the Sociedad Española de Construcción Naval, or the SECN. The SEC was a conglomerate of British and Spanish-owned industrial firms. 40% of the shares were held by British investors, and the remainder by Spanish, many of whom were Basque industrialists already operating in shipbuilding and other heavy industries along the northern coast. In 1909, the conservative Antonio Maura government officially contracted with the new company to build the new fleet. In addition to the shipyards themselves, many installations that had previously been in state hands, such as dry docks, foundries, and workshops, subsequently turned over to the SECN for operation. The firm consulted closely with British shipbuilders such as Vickers and Armstrong. Indeed, till the mid-1920s, the technicians and engineers employed by the SECN were almost exclusively British. In the 1930s, many Englishmen remained on staff, and when the Civil War began, many of the British employees of the SECN would decline evacuation and remain at their jobs throughout the war. A great deal of modernization of Spanish facilities and practice was carried out under the new firm's direction, and SECN facilities soon spread from El Ferrol to Bilbao, Gijón, Valencia, in addition to the other major facilities at Cadiz and Cartagena. As one might expect, given the high degree of British participation and collaboration, most of the ships the SECN built were based on contemporary British designs. These were then modified to meet Spanish Navy specifications. Many technologically advanced items, such as rangefinders, those with long lead times, such as heavy gun barrels, were not built in local facilities, but were ordered from British producers, chiefly Vickers and Armstrong Whitworth. This practice was a common one among naval powers of the second rank during these years. It would slow the Spanish fleet rebuilding program when the demands of the Great War led to years-long delays in the completion of foreign orders by British shipbuilders. Spanish ships begun before the outbreak of war in Europe sometimes have almost a decade pass between the laying of their keel and full completion due to this factor. To a large extent, the Spanish Navy that was created between 1910 and 1935 was composed of modified versions of contemporary British warship classes. One measure of the success of the new SECN was the completion time of its first major shipbuilding project, the lead ship of the España class. This battleship was built in just over 3 years from laying down the keel to delivery, not very different from what would be expected from the completion of a similar vessel in the UK itself. With the loss of the colonies, the responsibilities of the Navy had been reduced to that of providing security for the Spanish coasts, as well as securing the short sea routes between the peninsula, the island groups, and the African territories. Comparatively little call would be made on the Navy in the years between the Spanish-American War and the Civil War. The major exception to this was the fleet's involvement in the war fought against the RIF insurgency during the 1920s. The absence of an enemy navy made the fleet's part in this long conflict mostly a matter of transport services, shore bombardments in support of ground forces, and anti-smuggling operations along the coast. The Spanish did some pioneering work as they applied the new technologies of the day to the task of combating Abdel-Krim's rebellion. For example, the seaplane carrier Daedalus operated airships and floatplanes in a surveillance role, as well as launching bombing raids against coastal targets. Later, in 1934, during the rebellion of the miners in the province of Asturias, she would be the first ship to operate rotorcraft from her deck when autogyros were operated against the rebels there. The only major naval operation in the Rif War was the remarkable joint French-Spanish amphibious landing against Abdel-Krim's home territory at Alhucemas Bay on the 8th of September 1925. Naval gunfire, as well as air attacks by land-based planes and the Daedalus seaplanes, accompanied the troops as they rode British-made landing craft ashore a short distance from Ashtir, the center of power, the strongest of the Riffian Kabyles, or tribes, the Beni Uruguay. This landing was the only large-scale amphibious operation in European waters between Gallipoli and the German operations in Norway in 1940. It was instrumental in bringing the Moroccan conflict to a victorious conclusion. Its successful execution was an indication of the kind of accomplishment of which the new Spanish fleet was capable. The core of the battle fleet envisaged by the 1908 building program consisted of 3 dreadnought battleships of the España class. These were authorized by the Naval Law of 1908 and were intended to replace the Navy's sole remaining capital ship, the Palaio, which was a pre-dreadnought barbette ship built by the French in the 1870s. The Españas were a huge step forward for the Spanish. They were a true dreadnought design, with a formidable battery of 8 12-inch or 305mm 50 caliber naval rifles, mounted in 4 2-gun turrets, arranged in an echelon pattern so that 3 could bear on each broadside and 2 fore and aft. This main battery was supplemented by 24-inch or 102mm guns mounted singly in casemates along the broadsides. These guns were limited in range and utility by being mounted too close to the waterline. The Españas were powered by 12 coal-fired boilers, by 4 modern steam turbines, drove 4 shafts, which could propel it to a design speed of just under 20 knots. These were the smallest dreadnought battleships ever built, displacing just 16,000 tons fully loaded. Their small size was the result not only of financial considerations, but also by the size of existing Spanish docks and facilities. As a result, trade-offs were made in the design, and the ships had relatively weak armor, with only 203mm or 8 inches in the belt and turrets, and 254mm or 10 inches protecting the conning tower. The protection was especially poor against torpedoes, mines, and other underwater damage. The first 2 ships of this class, the España and the Alfonso XIII, were laid down in 1909 and 1910. The España was completed in October of 1913, and the Alfonso XIII in August of 1915. The third vessel, the Jaime Primero, or James I, was started in 1912, but the outbreak of the First World War meant that much of the advanced equipment that had been ordered from the British was retained for the Royal Navy's own use, and this delayed the battleship's completion until the last days of 1921. In 1923, during the Rif War, the original España was stranded on underwater rocks off the African coast at Cape Tres Forcas. Attempts were made to refloat her, including the removal of her heavy armor plates and main battery, but these proved unavailing, and the hull was abandoned following being further damaged during a storm. The 2 remaining Españas continued to see combat during the Rif War, engaging in shore bombardments in support of Spanish troops. After the 1931 revolution ended the monarchy, the Alfonso XIII, which was the name of the king at the time, was renamed for the lost España. In 1936, both of these battleships remained in the fleet. They were mostly inactive after the Rif War, and were suffering from neglect and mechanical problems. As a result, they were considerably less efficient as fighting units in 1936 than their design specifications might suggest. A program for 3 cruisers to accompany these battleships was authorized in 1914. 2 of these ships were canceled before they were completed due to financial considerations. The one which was finished, the Reina Victoria Eugenia, displaced 6,500 tons full load and was armed by 9 6-inch or 152mm guns and single turrets. Their design was derived from the British Birmingham class, of which the first ship was laid down in 1912. The ship was powered by steam turbines and had a design top speed of 25 knots. Wartime delays resulted in an 8-year build time, and when the ship was completed in 1923, she was already obsolescent. With the fall of the monarchy, she was renamed the Republica and served with the new government until 1935, when she was laid up in reserve at the base at Cadiz. Two remaining cruisers of the 1914 program were abandoned, and less expensive designs were put into production. These were the two cruisers of the Blas de Lezo class, the Blas de Lezo and the Mendez Núñez, both based on the British Caledon class. These were 6,000-ton light cruisers typical of early World War I British types. The main armament of these ships consisted of 6-inch, 152mm guns and single turrets. These ships also carried torpedoes and were capable of a design speed of almost 30 knots. They were laid down in 1917 and completed in 1924 and 1925. The Blas de Lezo was wrecked on underwater rocks off Cape Finisterre in 1932. Leaving only the Mendez Núñez in the 1936 fleet. The final class of cruisers to enter Spanish service before the Civil War, the light cruisers of the Príncipe Alfonso class, were begun around the same time as the Blas de Lezo class. They were larger vessels, displacing over 9,200 tons full load, and carrying a battery of 8 6-inch or 152mm guns and 3 double and 2 single turrets, as well as a secondary battery of 4 4-inch or 102mm guns and single mounts, as well as torpedoes. First was laid down in 1917 and completed in 1925. The other two ships of the class, the Almirante Cervera and the Miguel de Cervantes, were delayed in an effort to adjust their specifications to incorporate the naval lessons of the Great War. They were laid down in 1922 and 1926 respectively, and were completed in 1927 and 1930. Along with minor design modifications, the latter two ships had a slightly greater maximum speed than the first and a greater fuel capacity. After the fall of the monarchy, the lead ship was renamed from Príncipe Alfonso to Libertad. Mention should be made of a further pair of cruisers which were still completing at the time of the revolt. These were the two heavy cruisers of the Canarias class, the Canarias and the Baleares. These were modern 13,000-ton vessels with a main battery of 8 8-inch or 203mm guns, a secondary battery of 8 5-inch or 127mm weapons, and were designed to make 33 knots. These were similar to the British Kent class of heavy cruisers that would serve throughout World War II, and they would be the most formidable ships in Spanish hands during the Civil War once they were made seaworthy. At the time of the uprising, only the Canarias had received its full main battery, and both lacked half of their secondary battery. Both of the ships would be lacking weapons and other components while serving in Franco's wartime navy, but even with incomplete capabilities, they were likely to be dominant in any encounter between Spanish ships. Turning to lighter vessels, the most important elements here were the Churruca-class destroyers. 11 of these ships had been built before the uprising, and a further 5 were nearing completion at Cartagena. The first 2 ships had been sold to the Argentine Navy, leaving 9 in Spanish hands. These were one of the best destroyer classes of the interwar years, very seaworthy, agile, and with a top speed of almost 36 knots. They carried a battery of 5 5-inch or 127mm guns, as well as anti-aircraft weapons and torpedoes, could also carry and lay mines. They were based on the World War I British Scott class of destroyer leaders. The first pair was laid down in 1924. Churrucas would be the most modern ships of the Republican Navy and the most active ships in Spanish service during the war. An older class of destroyers, the Alcedo class, was also in service alongside the Churrucas. These ships dated from 1920 and carried 3 4-inch or 102mm guns, as well as torpedoes, were very similar to the kind of destroyers fielded by the great powers in the decade before the Great War. The 3 ships, the Alcedo, the Lazaga, and the Velasco, were second-line units in 1936, and like the rest of the older Spanish vessels, were in questionable mechanical condition. In addition, the Spanish had 10 torpedo boats and a dozen submarines on their strength. Submarines came in 2 6-ship classes, the C and B classes, were similar to British First World War designs. None were ocean-going types, but rather short-range coastal types best suited to Mediterranean waters. In addition to these major fleet units, the Spanish had about a dozen gunboats, a number of armed trawlers, a few mine layers and transport ships, some patrol vessels, and a seaplane carrier, the Daedalo. Latter was a converted German freighter and had seen service against Abdel-Krim during the Rif War. It was fitted with equipment for servicing seaplanes, airships, and observation balloons. The ship had no flight deck and operated her seaplanes from the water's surface by means of cranes. She had been placed in reserve and was put on inactive status in 1935. And I think that is where I will end this episode. Hope you found some of what I had to say here interesting or useful, and I hope you'll join me for the next part of this series. Till then, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.